Fantastic. The sound is on. Somebody ring the bell. Let people know we're going to get into studying for a little while. So there's a teen class going on. I know James wanted to teach a teen class, so you guys are teens are welcome there. But adults, if you want to study the temple with me for a little while longer, let's do this. We've been kicking this topic around for a little while, and sometimes I get on the topic, it's hard for me to land a plane because there's just so much. And when I get into the temple topic, it is so big. I don't know if you realize this or not, we spent 8 weeks talking about the importance of the temple in Jewish spirituality, in our worship, how much of a role it plays, all the different places that it touches, all the different things that we do essentially in Jewish tradition and Jewish worship that relate right back to the temple. They just go right back to that. That's where we get that pattern from. And so temple has played a huge, huge, significant role for Jewish people throughout history, and it continues to be so. And so we study the temple today, even though it's not standing, our hopes are still fixed on the words of the prophets that one day God will restore the temple. Because the prophet said so, we have to believe that this will happen. The ultimate redemption of this world, the coming of Messiah, son of David, the full manifestation of that in the world will only happen when the temple is standing. There has to be a temple in Jerusalem. It has to be on that spot, has to be in that place. How it will happen, I do not know. But I just believe and trust that before all things are said and done, whether Messiah is going to be the one who builds it or whether we build it and then Messiah comes, we have big disagreement of what happens first. We don't know. The fact is that we know that the prophecies about Messiah ruling and reigning in Jerusalem coincide with the presence of the temple and the sacrificial service actually happening right there. So today we'll continue studying the temple a little bit more. And so we have been studying what the temple worship must have looked like in the first century CE. The pictures that you're seeing is a reconstruction of Herod's temple. So they're from the first century descriptions. We don't know what it looked like 100%. People ask me, like, was the temple really decked out with the front, with the gold like that? And I say, I don't know. We have some reports, some writings that seem to suggest that, but because we don't have any actual remnants of that building, we don't know. It's not like somebody snapped a picture and left it for us. That's the thing. We don't. All we have is literary descriptions. And so since the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in the 70 CE, we can only reconstruct the past from the records, from the traditions that we have. Sometimes records and traditions we have disagree. One tells one thing and the other one tells the other, so who we believe? The ancient records are like that. Sometimes people tell the same story in a slightly different way, and maybe somebody embellishes it just a tiny bit, and maybe somebody forgets another detail. We don't know. What we do as historians, we take the information we have, we take the data, and then we reconstruct the scenario the best we can, knowing that not all the pieces that we have may be exactly perfect. So we use imagination of what it must have been like for people to be there. We previously imagined what it was like for non-Jews who came to the temple. We looked at what it was like for the priests, and so this time we'll imagine the perspective of the Levites as they were assisting worshipers, what it must have been for them. So this is me walking you through the day in the life of a Levite, essentially. So here's the temple once again. This is a reconstruction of what it might have looked like based on what we know. You could see it to the right. This would be the northern side. Right would be north. Okay, so you're looking from the east. Do you see the fortress of Antonia? This is where a lot of the quarters of the priests would have been in that, Levites would have been in that area. There was a chamber of the Levites located in that area somewhere. We don't know where exactly, but that's where it was. So, and you could see the temple kind of sitting right there in the middle, and you see the big plaza, which would have been open, and there's multiple entrances and exits that lead to this big plaza. Of course, the temple building itself is gated, and those gates close out, but the other place just has big openings and big doors, and some of them are wide open sort of say, and others actually have gates. Some of those gates are more decorative than anything, and others are more functional. So it was a very impressive structure. I told you before, like if you want to gauge the size of it, imagine a football field and imagine the main structure of the temple, the two courts that we keep looking at that are walled and protected by walls. That would be probably about a field and a half in length and about one football field in width. So that's what you're talking about. So that gives you the dimensions in your mind. So that's what we look at all the time as far as the temple goes. The building itself, the Heichal, as it's called, the actual holy place, that is not something that people got to see, people got to go into. This is just for the priests. But people got to observe the service that happened in the courtyard of the temple. That's what they got to see. That's what these courtyards are for. You have the court of women, and of course the court of the priests and the court of Israelites are side by side in that inner court. And those are the two main areas where people came and actually actively did things and worshiped. Most of the worship happened outdoors. What happened on the inside was just a secluded sort of say service before God, the lighting of menorah, the burning of the incense, the presentation of the breads and the changing of those breads later on. So that's what happened. So this kind of gives you an idea of what the temple looked like. Again, these are reconstructions. We're just doing the best we can based on the descriptions that we have that are literary, because we don't have any actual archaeological remains of the temple standing. But what I want you to notice is I want you to notice the steps. The whole entire temple is elevated slightly. There's steps that are leading to those gates that would lead you in. And right outside of those steps is where you would see a soreg. You would see a short fence that would be set up over there. It's about 4 feet tall. And it's the fence that you could look over, obviously, but it's the fence that lets people know, okay, if you're not an Israelite, you stop here. This is where you stop. The rest is really for Israelites. This is the temple of Israel, and it's God is living in the midst of Israel, and so this is sort of say that kind of a worship place that allows people to enter into different portions of the temple, depending on who they are, depending on what their station in life is, and so who you are essentially defines how far you can go. How close you can get into the very, very, very holy presence of God. And I realize that sometimes people think about getting into the presence of God, and they say, okay, if you can't get this close to God, somehow this is a bad thing. Actually, this is a good thing. You don't want to be close to God. You don't want to come too close to God, because guess what happens to some of the people who came a little too close to God? They have dropped dead in the past. So this is not a small thing. This is a serious thing. God's presence can be that overwhelming, that powerful. There are stories upon stories of pagans who breached the temple and marched themselves into the temple, and God struck them dead. And some of them had nightmares and were afflicted, went absolutely insane, because they decided to brazenly walk into this temple and see Jewish God. There's nothing to see. There is no, but they kept expecting that there's going to be some statue in there or something in there, because in their world, gods have bodies, shapes. And so here's this invisible God. So you really didn't want to go close to God face to face, because this was a very scary encounter, essentially. So the walls exist to protect us from protect God's holiness from us and our transgressions and the defilement that we bring. And all these layers of holiness also exist to protect us from God's anger and his wrath. Because if we have offended him, if we have disrespected him, coming close to him might not be a good idea. So this is, you're dealing with forces that are way beyond most of our everyday interactions. So just think about it this way. This is a perspective that people have because they don't always understand why all these layers and these protections, these walls, these courts, why such a multi-tiered system actually existed. So anyway, so let's get into the Levites. The Levites. Leviim. In the Second Temple period, they were a hereditary group. They were all descendants of Levi, right? Levi is one of the sons of Jacob. So everyone who is descended from Levi is a Levite. And this was a patrilineal descent. So anybody who was from that family was automatically a Levite. Now, to serve in the temple, you had to qualify a little bit. You had to live a pure life. You couldn't be disabled, for example, things like that. So just like for the priests, there were some qualifications. But if you were from the right family, essentially you could participate in the service of the temple. And just like the Kohanim, just like the priests, the Levites were organized into 24 divisions. This is completely parallel to what the priestly courses were. Remember I told you there were 24 courses of priests and that every one of them served twice a year? So 1 week you get twice a year to come out and serve. This is your turn. And that I told you that within the course, within one of those groups that will serve in the week, there would be subgroups broken up by each day. And each day all of them served. And on Shabbat all of them served, but each of the 6 days, only 1/6 of that group actually ministered. And the same thing happened with priests. The same thing happened with Levites. So we have sources that tell us that they were ranked and broken out in that same similar way, just completely following the pattern of the priests. And it's in 1 Chronicles. We can read about that. David actually is the one who organized all the orders of the priests and how they function. So rotating weekly, just like the priests, they kind of mimicked and followed that pattern. So the Levites were numbering approximately 9,600 during the first century. This is one of the numbers that we get. This is how many Levites there were, sort of say active in service, doing different things. And of course, like I told you, they didn't all show up at once. They served in groups. They did show up all to serve on the holidays. The 3 holidays, 3 pilgrim feasts, when the city of Jerusalem will be filled with visitors, that's when all the priests, all the Levites came because they needed all the help that they could get, because how many people they had to serve with sacrifices and all the assistance that they needed. So the Levites served as temple's musicians, they served as guards, and they served as assistants in every sort. The part that they did not do is anything that had to do with sacrifices. That they could not. That was completely segregated only to a Kohen. If you were not a descendant of Aaron, you were a Levite, the sacrifices you stay away from. Other things you could help with, you can assist. So before dawn would break over Jerusalem, the Temple Mount was already awake. Yeah, it actually never slept, which you have to realize. Before the sunrise, in the darkness, the Temple Mount was awake. In long hours of the night, the Levites would be gatekeepers, and they maintained their posts. They would be stationed throughout the temple. First Chronicles tells us they lodged around about the house of God. Upon them was the charge, and they had the duty of opening it every morning. So the Levites were the gatekeepers. They were the door openers. They were the guards. They were stationed there. In Mishnah, in Midot, it describes the gates. It says there was a great and bronze and gilded doors that were opening into the courts, and each of them was watched and appointed, and that watch was appointed to the Levites. Josephus in Antiquities also tells us and confirms to us that the Levites kept guard about the temple day and night. So this is a 24-hour service that they did. So this is why they rotated and they changed shifts. They had people who clocked out and people who clocked in. And if you did fall asleep, if you did happen to be fallen asleep as a Levite, another Levite would come around and they would tap you with their, they had like a wooden stick, basically. They would just kind of tap you and like, wake up. And if you fell asleep again, they would replace you. Somebody else would come to take your place because you obviously didn't get good enough sleep to be able to guard the gate. So this is an important task that they all had. Now, their task was sacred. It was not merely custodial. They were not just guards or security people who were just hired to stand there and look mean. The temple gates they symbolized the boundary between holy place and an ordinary space. And these gatekeepers, they waited to receive a signal from the officer of the watch, the Memuneh as he is called. And so he would tell them to open these massive gates. They took a lot of work. It actually took quite a few people to move those gates. They were quite heavy. And that would happen only after the lamb was checked, only after the altar was ready for the sacrifice, and the sun has arisen. So remember how we went to the ceremony of the priests. So while the priests are doing their thing, the Levites are getting ready. They're standing there waiting for the signal, because the signal will be given to them, and they would have to open the doors. But the doors will open only when the priest is ready, only when the lamb has been checked, when everything is. So everything has to coincide. The sun has to rise, the lamb has to be ready, the altar has to be ready, and then they would open the gates of the temple. And so these are these massive doors that they would basically guard, and this would be their job to watch over those doors. So 5 a.m., imagine this. Once the priests purified themselves, the Levites, they followed their example. A Levite immersed before the service, just like a priest would immerse before the service. Mishnah says in Kelim, no one enters the court unless he has immersed himself. So where would they immerse? There were multiple chambers. There were mikvot all throughout. There was, of course, today, if we go to the southern sides of the Temple Mount with the big steps, the steps of the rabbis, we could see the remnants of many, many mikvot. I mean, there's like hundreds of mikvot that would be built there. Of course, back in those days, they would be closed in. They would have little roofs. People go in, take off their clothes, dunk themselves in a cold water that was basically a runoff water from the rain. Many of those mikvot were connected through little channels, and water rotated. And so people would go in, dunk themselves in the cold water, put their clothes on, and they would go into the temple. There were a lot of mikvot inside the temple as well. Actually, there were chambers underneath the courts that had mikvot. And within the walls, within the different houses, there were different chambers. There were also private mikvot, and synagogues had them. Private houses of really wealthy people also had them. So they were public, they were private places to go, and they would go and immerse themselves, and then it would enter the court. And they actually stayed within the precincts of the temple, right nearby, right next to the temple. They did not leave on their week of service. They were there. So they would immerse themselves, just as the priests would immerse themselves. Again, remember, this all begins before the sunrise. And then the Levites, they would dress. They would dress in average, clean clothing. It would be distinct from a white priestly linen garments. And then it would gather in the chambers along with the northern wall, where they would be assigned their duties. So just like the priests would basically have a lottery and cast lot to decide who gets to do what, Levites had a very similar system. We don't know exactly what it was, but something similar, we assume. So they would get dressed. They would not be wearing the same clothes. It's important. So the Kohanim, they wore white linen tunics. They had turbans on their heads. They had sashes. There were also white linen sashes. And they had special undergarments. They had essentially ancient version of pants that they wore, also linen, as they walked up and down the ramp of the altar, and they ascended and descended. So Levites, as far as we can tell, they did have some kind of special clothing, but we don't have a lot of information about it. We know that it was different from the priests. Maybe it was white, maybe it was not, but somehow people could tell apart by looking at the clothing of who was a priest and who was not a priest. And so many people assume that they must have just worn clothing that was more average, more like everybody else. But perhaps it was white and maybe it was most likely linen to be light. So they would get their duties at 5 o'clock in the morning. It will be all assigned to them, and they would start going to their stations and preparing for what they had to do. 5:30 a.m. The Levites who were chosen to sing, some of them would get the job of singing. And that was a big part for Levitical service. They would continue probably to the chambers right underneath the main court. What you didn't realize is that that main plaza, that main court, there were subterranean chambers there. They would go down there, and they would probably have their vocal exercises, stretch their vocal cords a little bit, get ready to sing. They would tune their instruments. This is where the instruments were stored. They were stored right underneath that plaza. So Josephus tells us that the Levites were skillful in music. These were not just people who just kind of went, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, you sing today. They were picked for their talent. It was really important. They trained for a long time. So this is what Mishnah tells us in Tractate Arachin of how this went about. The rabbis write, the minimum number of Levites who sing is 12, no fewer. So got to have at least 12. The greater limit was not fixed. So you could have 25 if you wanted, or 30, or 50 if that's what was needed, but at least 12. The number of musical instruments is not fewer than 2 harps and no more than 6, because having too many will get confusing. They need the harps for the tune. They don't need them to overwhelm the voices. And so sometimes harps are difficult to tune, by the way. So no more than 6. And there were never fewer than 9 lyres, and cymbals were never lacking. And by cymbals, I do not mean those big orchestral cymbals like you would see in a modern chamber music. I'm talking about smaller cymbals, okay? Something a little bit more manageable, not those big loud ones, right? So imagine that picture. So you have Levites, a handful of musical instruments, maybe a dozen of them, maybe 20 or so standing there getting ready to sing. All decked out, dressed, ready, prepped. They practiced, they tuned their instruments. That's what they would do at 5:30 in the morning when there was their turn to come and sing. They would get ready. So then just, at 6 is when the sacrifices would begin. They would open the doors. At 6:30, the gates, 6 or 6:30, I'm kind of estimating all this because depending on the time of the year, the timing will change. After the gates were open and the priests would blow the silver trumpets. Remember, the priests would go up. They blow those silver trumpets. That's when the moment of their song came. And the priest would pour wine libation, a nesech, up on the altar. So remember, as we read the Torah commandments about the Olah, it says that we were to offer also a wine libation with it. So when the wine libation would be poured upon the altar, in the next court, just right behind him, the Levitical choir would begin their praise. That's when all these people who are assembled to sing, they would sing. And Josephus describes it this way. He says, when they would sing hymns to God, the sound reaches to every great distance, insomuch that the sound seems to be one voice. So why is this happening? Because you have this atmosphere all surrounded by limestone. Just the way the architecture is, the sound begins to bounce off these stone walls. And if you understand where they were singing, and I'll show you in a second, it might make sense a little bit more of how the acoustic works. But their voices carried in the court and way, way far beyond the court. So for the Levite, this moment was the culmination of the years of their training. This was really important. Every Levite wanted to do this, to sing during the moment of the morning Olah or the evening Olah, the Tamid sacrifices, or even the Musaf sacrifices, or the holiday sacrifices, to stand on the steps right there and to sing before God, to lead the entire congregation of Israel in meditation and prayer in these songs. That was probably the most ultimate hope that a Levite would have. And they would train for years and years and learn. And whether they do an instrument or sing or do both, whatever their talent was, that's what many of the Levites would hope for. This was the high point for them in the temple service. Just as the sacrifices begin, they would begin to sing. So the singers, they would come out to the court of women. So you could see right here, we are looking at the court of women. We're actually standing, like this is a vantage point from the wall. As if you were standing on the wall and looking down into the court of women, this is what you would see. So this is the Ezrat Nashim, and they would stand on the steps by the Nicanor gate. So you can see this big, massive bronze gate. That's the main gate that opened into the court of the priests where the sacrifices were brought. So they would stand between the court of the priests and in the court of women. And this court was 135 cubits, we're told, and was square, roughly about 200 feet by 200 feet. Can you imagine? 200 feet by 200 feet. That would be a size of the women's court. And so we're looking down from the walls. The walls were about 40 cubits high. And people could ascend. People would go up those walls. What you didn't realize is the walls were double. There was in the middle, you can literally go up the stairs and walk in there. Just like the walls of Jerusalem today, if you've been inside, you've seen you can actually walk in the walls, inside the walls of Jerusalem. So Mishnah describes the scene to us this way. It says, in the court of women, there were 4 chambers. And we saw the plan, the view of kind of like these 4 little corner areas. In one, they stored wine, and another, the oil, and the third was frankincense, and the fourth was wood. So there were supply areas, essentially, and guess who managed them? The Levites also managed those rooms. They were assisting the priests in every task possible. They were managers of a lot of those items. And this was the main area where the entire families regularly gathered for worship. The court of women was the family worship area, if you want to think of it this way, because you could have everyone there. As long as you were ritually pure, people would come there and they could stand there. And in the holiday time, the men would fill up the court of women, and the women would stand on the walls and would fill up that area. Because so many visitors would come to the temple, basically the court of women got overrun by men. Because guess what? There's actually not enough place in the court of Israelites for all the men to fit. It's a very small area. You can only have a handful of people there observing the sacrifices at a time. You couldn't even fit 100 people there if you wanted to. It'd be too much. So this was the main area of worship, and that's why the Levites came out here, and on those steps is where they would sing. That was their stage. That was their platform. So around 6 a.m. or so, the Levites would begin to sing on those steps. And those steps, you could see them, they worked a little bit like an elevated stage. It was nice, about 15 feet wide, 16 feet high, and they provided a very nice acoustic advantage that allowed their voices to carry throughout the courtyards. And so just the way that place was built, this was the best place to sing. Mishnah Tamid tells us that on Sunday they would sing from Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. I mean, you can read, actually Mishnah lists to us all the different songs and psalms that the priests would sing. Every day had an appointed psalm. On Sunday you sing this psalm, on Shabbat you sing this song, on Monday this one, on Tuesday that one. We still follow this tradition every day. It's the same. If you can open your Siddur and there is a psalm, it's called Shir Shel Yom, a song of the day. And why? It's because that's what the Levites sang in the temple. We still follow that same exact pattern. And of course the Levites, one of their jobs, part of their training was to not just sing those songs, but also remember, preserve the melodies, and teach them to the next generation, passing on the tradition of this is how we sing this psalm. This is how we lift up our voices here or bring down our voices here. So the melodies were, and the way you play the instruments were passed down. This was all part of their job. And psalms that were assigned different portions were for different parts of service. This is the one I'm talking about right now. This would happen, for example, on Sunday during the Allah. Just when the doors would open, they would sing. They would begin with the psalm of the day, but they would also move on to other psalms. So, like for example, when we sing Psalm 136, that would be one of the psalms that they would sing in the temple courts, and we still do that today. Again, it's still part of our practice. So, many of the things that are in the Siddur, in many ways, they're mimicking of what was happening in the temple in those days. So about 6:30 a.m. or so, the Allah that was already being offered, and as the sacrifices are being brought, as this main lamb is now being brought, and the libation is being poured out, and oil is being poured out, now the priest, as he pours out the libation, they would sing. And it says that they would sing hymns to God, and it would travel great distances. Now, I want you to just see these doors. Like imagine this is what it was like for them to stand, and behind you these massive doors. The Levites, they served a lot like the priests did. The Mishnah specifies that a Levite enters the service at 25 years old and then leaves at 50. So that was their retirement age. It doesn't mean that they stopped being a Levite. That just means that they changed their job. That means that they may not be singing at a temple anymore. That means that they might be training people still. They will be teaching. There's a lot of other tasks they could do, but their jobs in some ways were physical. All of these jobs, they were not all about just walking out and waving your hands, serving in the temple, bringing sacrifices, or assisting priests with sacrifices. That meant carrying wood or carrying water. They didn't have plumbing, things like that. Somebody had to clean things too. So it was a lot of hard physical work. And that's why people served at that age. And then after that, they just did other things. But not as physically exerting. So that, imagine the moment when hundreds of voices would join in perfect harmony. And as the Levites would sing, standing there on the steps that leads to the court of the priests, all of these people would sing along. If you came to the temple on a regular basis, you knew which song they were going to sing on Monday morning, because that's the same song they sing every Monday morning. And you could join in, and you could be a part of that. And after a while, you learn those songs, you learn those tunes. If you could make it to the temple, and people in Jerusalem could, there's nothing stopping them. You just had to get up early in the morning to be there for the sunrise service. They could come and join. And so, as they sang, all these voices just would echo in the limestone walls. I don't know if you can imagine just hundreds and hundreds of people singing and joining the choir of the Levites. To me, sounds pretty amazing. I try to imagine in my mind what it would have been like if we could stand there in the court of the women and just take in what was happening. So around 7 a.m., the Levites, they would pause. And then the high priest would come out through the steps, and he would come and bless Israel with Aaron's blessing. Same thing happens today. It's the job of the priest to give a blessing to all worshipers. And so he would come out, say a blessing, and after he would recite the blessing, they would resume their singing. And then this same similar ceremony would take place before sunset during the second Timid offering. On the weekday, there were two main offerings, one in the morning and one in the evening. Now, what happened in the middle of the day? All sorts of offerings that people brought, all the first fruits that people brought that needed to be before the Lord. You have your firstling, you had your goat had babies, and now so you bring your first baby goat right there. Or if not, you can bring money. There's all sorts of things. There were first fruits, there were offerings, there were sacrifices that were brought for sins, guilt offerings. All of that took up the rest of the afternoon. There were all sorts of people bringing offerings that were personal on behalf of themselves. The morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice, they were communal sacrifice. They were for the benefit of all the people, for everyone. And that's why there was an elaborate ceremony, because it was a corporate worship. And so what happened later on in the afternoon, those were more individual and private things that people took before the Lord. And of course, the priests and Levites were there to assist them in doing all of that, because somebody has to manage all of that. But the main parts happened in the morning and in the evening. And of course, on Shabbat, there would be a musaf. So after the morning service was done and one lamb was brought, there would be another lamb, an additional lamb would be brought on Shabbat. And I guess on Rosh Chodesh, again, that would be an additional sacrifice. On any kind of holiday, there would be additional sacrifices. There are prescriptions in the Torah that tell you exactly what would have been brought. And so that's why the priests and the Levites were necessary to follow that structure, to follow the commandments that Hashem has given, essentially. So the Levites provided security. Well, people don't realize this, and they kept order all over the temple grounds throughout the day, not just at night. At night, of course, they stood as guards, but during the day, they also made sure nobody started acting out. Occasionally, things would break out. People would get upset, like anything else. Occasionally, with all the visitors, people would try to sabotage things occasionally. Just imagine when you have like an open arena, a stadium. Think of how many people are at the stadium, and somebody might want to do something not nice. So they were security. The Levites kept watch at 21 places in the temple. There were 21 stations where they positioned themselves. And the guards were armed with wooden staves rather than weapons. They did not carry swords. They did not carry spears. Why? Because it's a holy place. But they would have wooden staffs. That was their only weapons that they had. And they maintained the sanctity of the temple. They had to probably put some people in their place. There were incidents, especially with Samaritans. Occasionally, Samaritans would cause trouble. And we read in the Mishnah a story of how they brought, I think they brought bones or something like that into the temple because they wanted to desecrate the temple. You're not supposed to bring dead things in there. And they brought bones of some unclean animal or something like that. And they wanted to ruin it for everybody. So, of course, whose job would be to put them out? The Levites. They would have to catch them, get them out of there, and restore order to the temple. So, and I imagine that Josephus kind of writes and hints to us that they also instructed visitors in the proper offerings and ritual behavior. So there were Levites stationed everywhere. And if you had questions, you can talk to a Levite. They were standing right there at the gates, even outside by the mikvahot. They could tell people, okay, this is how you do it. This is what you do it. So again, remember, they're there to serve. They're there to assist. That's their job. That is their service. That's their purpose of being who they are. They have no other occupation except to do that, to help people come and worship and keep the holiness of the whole entire experience in the temple. So they did provide security, but also what they did is Levites acted as logistical aids to the priests. Levites maintained temple vessels. They maintained storehouses of goods. We can read about that again in Chronicles chapter 9, 1 Chronicles. It actually tells you that they were the custodians, managers of stuff. There was a lot of stuff in the temple that needed to be managed. Now the priests did some of that, but the Levites did a lot of that. That was, again, a task that fell to them. So guess what? If you didn't get to sing, you got to manage a storeroom or something, like that. There were plenty of jobs for them to do. We know that Levites oversaw weights because, remember, things had to be measured. In order for them to be measured, you put them on a scale. So they had to do weights and measures. The temple treasury, there's a lot of money that came into the temple. There were donation boxes that were stationed right outside the doors, and people came in and dropped coins, and those coins would be emptied out, and they would be carried away. They would be counted, and they would keep an account of what came in. Why? Because certain sacrifices might have to be bought, certain items had to be purchased, items have to be replaced, new items have to be purchased. Maybe stonemasons have to repair certain walls, rebuild certain staircases. Who knows? Temple had needs, and those funds they managed. They basically managed the treasury. They were the bankers, if you want to think about it that way. That was the job of a Levite. Now, the priests did preside over that process as well, but they worked together. Remember, Levites, they were the assistants in logistical matters of all sorts in every way possible. So, according to Mishnah and Tamid, they even got to do things like to prepare wood and the salt for the sacrifices. We are told that they helped the priests with animals. They could lead the animals to the priests. The priest has to still verify if the animal is good enough, but they could lead the animal to the priest. And of course, they can consult with the worshipers on that, what is appropriate. And when needed, they would even help with skinning and washing of the sacrifices. So that probably didn't happen very often, but if it was necessary, in a pinch, they could stand in for that. Although most of the time, they stayed away from any kind of altar-related duties. Why? Because it's very important to keep the distinction of who is a Kohen and who is a Levite. Because these families serve their purposes, and as long as they function within their purposes, there will be no strife, there's no competition. Each one of them has a task and a way to serve Hashem, and they find fulfillment in doing that which belongs to them, to their area of purview, their expertise. And the way Hashem looks at that, I'm sure he's pleased when people are doing what they're supposed to do. They're fulfilling their duties. So they try to stay away from any kind of altar-related duties by design. That was something that they guarded against, clearly. So some of the Levites, they served as treasurers, I told you. They oversaw the resources of the temple. That was a big part of their job. Some managed the temple archives as well. I don't know if you realize this or not. Temple had archives. It was also a place where records of all sorts were kept. There were deeds, there were titles, there were genealogical records that were kept at the temple. There were records of loans and contracts that involved the temple. Sometimes people gave their property to the temple. So the deed to that property would be kept at the temple. And if that property was used by the temple or later turned into a sum of money because it was sold or something like that, or a family came to redeem it because they wanted it back, if somebody donated their land to the temple, a family can later come back and says, can we have it back? Whatever its value, the market value, we'll pay it because we want to keep that land in a family. It's been in our family for a long time and we want to do that. So sometimes people would make a vow and they would say, my house or my land belongs to the temple. And that means they would write a special document, a deed, a promissory note, and the Levites would have to keep that in their archives. When they fulfilled the vow, they can have their land or house back. But sometimes it stayed with the temple. So, yes.
Basic housekeeping.
Yes.
So the priests lived on the premises. Some of the Levites did. They're there for many hours. There needs to be a kitchen, feeding,
Yes.
laundering, removing their bathroom stuff. When they go, who does all that? I guess that's the next couple of lessons coming through.
No,
Not really, or you don't know.
No, I mean, I may go into that if you really want to get
No,
into that.
just a curiosity.
That's a good curiosity. You're thinking like a practical person, like
Oh, I'm
what
very
happens?
practical. Also, with all the mikvah,
Yeah.
mikvot, they're taking off the clothes they're wearing.
Yes.
They're dunking.
Yes.
They have to dry themselves. They have
Yes.
to then put on clean, fresh clothes.
Yes. There are multiple changes of clothes.
And exchanges and places for all this.
Yep.
Locker rooms, you know,
Yep.
whatever's.
So
It's
we-
a major.
This is a major
situation.
undertaking, but I want you to realize, like again, when people think of a Levite, they think of a guy who stands up and sings, right? But there are many other jobs that Levites would have to do. Like somebody had to do laundry. You realize that?
And feed
Somebody
them-
had to
and
keep
feed
up,
them during the
keep
day.
those clothes. Like exactly. Somebody had to feed people.
Housekeeping.
So there was a lot of housekeeping tasks that would be done. And that's what these men serving and showing up over there, they would all do. All of these things would divvy up, depending on what fell to you. There were multiple areas that were given, and people got training in certain parts, and they did it. And again, all of that is service to the Lord, because guess what? A Levite who has to sing has to wear fresh clothing, and that clothing has to come from somewhere. And there's changes of Levitical orders coming in and coming out all the time. So this is this big rotating system. So you have them custodians of a place, but there's a constant movement as the orders change. It's a major undertaking. It takes a lot of, so imagine some people, all they did is managed. All they did is coordinated everybody else. There were people walking around telling everybody what to do, because if they didn't, it wouldn't get done. And they wouldn't know what to do next. So there were some people who were just general management, essentially, telling everybody what to do.
So there must have been kitchen facilities
Yes.
and laundry facilities in the premises themselves
Yes, so-
somewhere.
So they did some cooking. There was some rudimentary cooking, some very, very basic cooking that happened. Now remember, the Levites ate off of the tithes and offerings which Israelites brought, which was a lot of times all sorts of grain products, fruit products, oil. It could be fruits and veggies of all sorts that would be brought. Those would be fresh. Some of them are dried, preserved. They would be brought. Those are tithes and offerings. Levites got a portion of that. That was the whole idea. Some of it was offered to the Lord, and some of it went to the Levites to feed them. And the priests ate from that. Now, the priests also ate from the altar. The Levites did not get a chance to eat from the altar because that was holy to the Lord, and they didn't come to them. Certain portions went to the Levites, but only some, not everything. So there was a system, and so some cooking happened, essentially. And they were areas, and I'm sure that but they weren't like dining halls or anything like that. They weren't banqueting. This was a very utilitarian type moment of service. When they came in for a week of service, they knew they're going to be working hard and they're going to wear themselves out. And after that week, they're going to need a little break, because for a week they would have worked really, really hard, getting up early in the morning, going to bed probably late at night, and doing the same thing all over. And that's why they took shifts. That's why they took turns. They backed up each other. There were a lot of times people in training who were backing other people up. And if something happened to that person, immediately a person could step in and do their job. It was a very complicated system, and we're trying to reconstruct it based on all the little records we have. But again, the records that we have, they're not complete. They don't tell us every tiny little detail of like, where did he do laundry? Like, I would like to know that too, but I'm sure there was a place. So they did have water facilities there. On the northern wall was a massive reservoir of water. The water was trapped as it would come down in Kidron Valley. They would trap the water and divert it essentially into this massive reservoir. It was called the Pool of Israel. Even today, if you go to Jerusalem and you go to like the Lion's Gate, right inside the Lion's Gate, the walls have moved a little bit, but if you go inside the Lion's Gate, there's a church of St. Anne. And under that church, there you can still find old reservoirs of water that were there from the temple days. They're very easy to recognize because they're very deep. They're down underground. They're plastered. The walls are plastered so that they could preserve and hold water so the water would not seep out. And so we know that there were massive storages, subterranean storages of water that people could draw water from. And of course, if they needed it for taking it in, they would have to boil it. But other than that, it could be used for all sorts of washing and cleaning and things like that. The animals were washed. It was right next to a sheep gate in that area, and the sheep would come in, and the sheep, of course, had to be cleaned off, because if you've seen sheep coming from the field, you don't want to bring that into the temple. So they get cleaned up, before they get brought in, and then they inspect it, and then you decide if this animal makes the cut for the sacrifices or not. If not, they're sent out. Yes.
When we read about the offerings, there are many places where the offering, the priestly portion, is shared with not only the priests but the wives and the children and the
Yes.
slaves and all that. So, in these weeks of when they're there, do they always come with their families, or is it only the Kohens that come with the families and the Levium don't?
It depends. So for the holidays, I would
The
imagine
women are involved
some
in the
families,
process,
there were some women involved. For the holidays, a lot of people came to worship
Right.
to Jerusalem, and some people had a place to stay in Jerusalem. They could come. They had relatives. They might have stayed on the outskirts of Jerusalem, but you could. And so people traveled. It depends. If you lived in Jerusalem, that's one thing. But if you lived outside, in one of the Levitical cities, for example, or something like that you would have to travel in. So there was a lot of logistics involved. I would imagine the families would come sometimes, but not at other times. But if they came, the families. So when the Torah talks about them eating things together, it tells you that they had a right to it. It doesn't mean that they got the chance to every single time, but they had the option to. So when that was possible, that was possible. In any way, those portions that they could take them home to their families as well, like as they travel back.
They were only there a week. They could.
They're only there for a week, exactly. They can take things back, and there were people traveling back and forth all the time, bringing portions that were holy from the altar that only the priests can eat. Once it was offered on the altar, only the priests can eat that food. Nobody else is allowed to touch it.
And they're restricted where they can eat it.
Right, where they can eat it, only the priests can eat it. And so you can imagine there was a lot of logistics with transporting that food.
Right.
So we have a whole category of food that is prohibited to Israelites.
Right.
It's perfectly good and kosher food. You just can't have it because it was sacrificed. And it's not for you. It belongs to the Lord. And so the priest has a right to it, other people don't. It's a very complicated and interesting system, but temple, I have more questions than answers, honestly. But as I start to study the system, it was so complicated and it was so sophisticated. They took so much organization to pull it all off, which makes sense how big this institution was, how important it was. And with that, of course, there was corruption. So we read in the scriptures about corruption. The priests had access to treasury and things like that, and there's funny business with money going on here and there. And of course the Romans came in, they wanted some of that money. They're like, we know Jews have all this money in the temple, and they did rob a few times, and the wars started. Jewish wars against Rome started because people taking money from the temple treasury that should not have been done. Again, offenses like that happened all the time. So very, very interesting system. Other questions you guys have?
I've not read, so I don't know, but the
Well,
animals,
read
I
me.
mean, sheep, goats, cattle, birds, every kind of thing. I'm thinking some may have been held but not for long, and some may have been used right away. I don't know. Can we read about that in this?
So the most of the animals were kind of a private enterprise. Like once they came into the temple precincts, then the Levites and the priests took care of them for the short period of time that they were supposed to be there.
Yeah.
And believe me, with animals, that means that occasionally animals will make messes, right?
Right.
Who had to clean them up?
Levites.
Again, the same people who showed up to do this. Right? Somebody has to be the pooper scooper, right? I'm sorry, but that's just reality of having animals. And so most of the animals were kept outside the temple. So there were stalls outside that the merchants held, and they came in, and outside of that, there were fields all over Jerusalem where animals were kept at pasture. They were brought in for this purpose in whatever amounts they were necessary. People knew when the holidays were going to be coming. They knew when the demand was going to be high. They knew what needed to be brought in, so they brought those animals closer. Other than that, they stayed more in the farming areas on the outskirts. And so, yeah, I'm sure people had businesses where they had shops where you could buy all sorts of animals, and you could make a deal. So, because it's Jerusalem, it's a marketplace. That's what happens. You make a deal.
That way you didn't have to travel with your sacrifice.
No, you didn't have to. Like some people,
Take the chance
some
that it
people
might be
found it
damaged or
meaningful to bring their own. But imagine taking a baby goat from Galilee all the way and drag that animal all the way to Jerusalem. I mean, you got several days of walking, and you're going to bring this animal along. It would be meaningful if that's actually from your flock. Yes, especially if that animal is good enough to be sacrificed. It's perfect, has no blemishes. Everything is good, but something happens and that goat starts limping, and all of a sudden it's not going to be picked for the sacrifice.
I'm just sitting here imagining this guy going, yeah, all my goats are perfect for, yeah, come on and get one. You know, he's like trying to sell these. I've handpicked them. They're all perfect.
Have I got a deal for you?
Yeah.
Then later on he has to give refunds because he
Right.
overtalked them. He overhyped his merchandise. Yeah, I'm sure there were refunds happening all the time. People would say, the priest rejected this one. I bought this from you. Here's my receipt. You know, it's from Shmuel's goat stand. Here's the receipt. You know, I want my money back. And they say, just keep the goat. Go roast it, eat it. You know, we give you credit, store credit. Guess Jews have been doing this for a long time. You know, so retail, wholesale, it all works.
Maybe like I said, it's been so sophisticated that these people selling these animals may have already cleaned them up and everything too.
Yeah.
Or was that something that the Levites had to do?
Levites had to checking and making sure, but it made sense that you would clean up your animals and things like that. So animals came in sometimes for the communal sacrifices. Again, they would come in from the flock, from the outside. Who knows where they've been? They'd have to be cleaned up before they brought in. But then there were individual sacrifices. Those were different. You know, that's a whole different sort. So we can only imagine what that enterprise was like and what it took to make this all happen. So something that also happened is, besides all the records, like I said, they did the tithe. They collected the tithe. They brought them to the temple. They managed the charity networks. The temple also supported the poor. There was a lot of money donated to the temple. Guess what? Some of that money went right back to the community, and it supported the poor. There were lots of people who were destitute, had no way of supporting themselves. Maybe they were disabled. They could not work. They could not earn a living, and they needed to eat. So there were entire networks, and sometimes it is the priests and the Levites who actually ran those charities. They ran those networks. A lot of times these houses, entire places that would have been set up on the outskirts of Jerusalem, maybe not right in Jerusalem, but way out where the real estate is a little bit more affordable, but still travelable within a distance. And they would take the money and they would buy the food and they would give it to the people who needed to support themselves because they couldn't otherwise. So they had no means of doing that. So there was a network, a charitable network that also worked within the local synagogues. Local synagogues took care of the people within their own community. Everybody knew who their poor was. There were widows in the synagogue who people knew they couldn't afford. They didn't have the means. So synagogue would support them because they knew from the communal gathering that they got, that's people were able to survive essentially. The system was different. It's not like they had Social Security and Medicare and all of that stuff. So somebody had to provide all that. And so the temple, the synagogues, they were providing some of these same services that we can think about back in those days. So there you go. There's the institution. There's a lot of things that Levites did. And I kind of gave you an idea of what the day of a Levite would be, what kinds of things that they would be involved in. And now you know how this place runs. So when people show up for worship, that's wonderful. That's one experience. But what the Levites have to do and what the priests get to do, you got the little back tour. You kind of go behind the wall and get to see some of the things that they do. So there you go. There's the chambers. There's the storage places. All right? Yes. Go ahead.
So we women, when we ask our husbands to please wash the dishes, don't allow them to say we're not a Levite.
That's right. That's right.
For any one particular Levite, how often would they actually have a week at the temple?
Twice a year.
Twice a year.
Twice a
Every
year,
single one of them?
and on
So-
the holiday, on the three main pilgrim holidays.
So it wasn't something where there was like a lottery system where only some of them got to go because that's all that was needed? Every single,
There were a lot of
was
tasks
able
for
to
them
go
to
twice.
do, and some people went even if they didn't have a specifically assigned job. They would be training for a job. They would be assisting.
Okay.
Like I said, somebody had to carry the wood, and somebody had to carry the water, and somebody had to take care of the animals, and somebody just had to stand and answer questions of all the other people because you're the only person who was trained. One of the things that Levites also did, whether you realize this or not, they were involved in an education system. Levites were the teachers of Israel. So not in the temple, but right outside the temple, there were a lot of facilities and places where Levites taught and explained Torah to people. This is what we read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Standing and reading the Torah out loud and explaining it to people. They were copyists, they were scribes, but they were also the explainers of all these things. They're the ones who maintained all the traditions, they're the ones who studied it, they were educated, and that means they could basically teach everyone else who didn't know how to read. Because at that point, a percentage of population was literate, but literate only to a degree. People might be able to read basic stuff to participate, but they didn't have the kind of learning that you and I would have, where they were just completely versatile and at home with most books. I mean, books were not around. Remember, that was a rare thing. How many times did you get a chance to look at the scroll if you were living in the first century? Rarely, right? So how many times did you encounter the writing? It would be a very important document that you would come across that you would see. But most of the time, we're just inundated by our mundane paperwork that we have all the time. Yes, go ahead.
So, you said last week about the priests, and we knew chronicles about the division.
Yeah.
You said also that their tasks were assigned by lottery
Yes.
and by lot, and that to burn incense was a once a year, a once in a lifetime.
It was kind of a special honor. Yeah.
So, and I did not know that, and I just was actually happened to be reading in Luke just last
Go ahead.
week.
Yeah.
I almost fell in my chair. Now, while he was serving his priest before God, when his division was on duty, that part I knew, but according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot, this is Zechariah,
Yes.
to enter the temple of the Lord to burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at that hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him, getting a little too close.
Yeah.
And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call him John." And so this was a once-in-a-lifetime thing. He just happened to be there, and he could have been there. He's old now.
Yeah.
That could have felt, the lot could have fallen to him for years, but it never did.
Yep.
It was at this appointed
Suddenly
time.
that was his term, and Zechariah was in the right place in the right time.
There's the angel.
And he has an
the
angelic
Lord.
encounter, yes.
And look, I mean, oh my
Good.
God.
Yes.
That is, this is like, this is a stories or fairy tales, or like you have to be like kind of soft to believe all this stuff. But it's so size.
Yes.
I just think that.
Isn't that amazing? When you connect the dots, I love it.
So cool.
I love it. So the reason why I tell you these stories, okay, so that you can take those other stories and connect them with these stories. Brit Chadashah is full of stories of the temple. There's so much that happens in the temple. I mean, you realize this. I'm laying this background, and the next time I'm going to be talking about cleansing of the temple, you're going to know what I'm talking about. Because you realize where the merchants sold their stuff in the temple. That it wasn't right here in this plaza. It's not like there were goats walking around, women. That was not going to happen, you know. But we can discuss a lot of the things that we read about in the Brit Chadashah, knowing this setting. Yes.
Well, just to add what Beverly was saying, because we can know Zechariah's rotation
Yes.
because of you know his clan or his father. So the King David set up, you know, so you can kind of figure out.
We can actually trace when it happened, is what you're saying.
At least twice. Or one
Yes,
or two
twice.
times,
So if I wanted to know what day, or what date, or what week it was that Zechariah was serving in the temple, knowing the family, the priestly family he belonged to, I can actually calculate what are possibilities. And it would have been twice a year, and then 3 holidays. Remember that. Because it doesn't say that it might have possibly been a holiday that he got to pick to burn incense. We don't know. So now we have, if you want to go, there are some people who have gone, because I've ran into people who really wanted to know when Yeshua was born. And so they figured out a backwards way of calculating it in a very methodical way. They knew it wasn't December 25, right? They figured this out. The difference between him and Yochanan is 6 months exactly. We know the difference. So if you can figure out when Yochanan was conceived, you can figure out when Yeshua was conceived. And now you have an exact date by knowing which priestly family Zechariah belonged to. Some people try to do that, but the problem is you have 5 possible moments in a year of when they could have happened. So people still are left guessing. Because even this backwards sort of say method of trying to calculate things still can't figure this out. But it really is important for them to know when.
Can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So that would kind of be like a view from Mount of Olives.
Yes.
Looking at the
Yep.
ground.
Yeah, if the bema is the Mount of Olives, that's kind of like what I'm looking at right there.
Like Golgotha, like would be kind of close as well.
Yeah, so that would be. Let's see if I have another photo there for you. I can show you where that was. So further in the city, further out in the city, right. The temple walls around this is just the temple, but there was such a thing as a city wall. And outside of the city wall is where Golgotha would have been. And so I could show it to you on the modern map of where it was, and you could see the layout. But it would have been a little bit further out on the outskirts, outside of the walls of the city.
Or like you could see, like we're on the mountain right now, on Mount
Right.
Olives right now. We can see in the temple, but the temple can also look up and see on the hill.
Yeah.
On the
So
mountain.
if you were walking on the slopes, down the slopes of the Mount of Olives, if you were in Gethsemane, you got a really good view into the courtyard of the temple. I mean, you were far away, but you got a view. And when the sacrifices were burned, you saw it. And at night, when the priests burned all the fat, that made a huge fire. You could see it from far away because it would light up the whole city. Because remember, the temple is on the hill, and there's valleys around, and there's mountains around. So if you're on one of those mountains, you could still see the temple quite far away. I'm going to give you something just for fun. Peter travels to the city of Jaffa. He's up on the roof. He's praying, right? He gets hungry. Remember? He has the vision. You realize that he's praying. He could probably see the smoke all the way to Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem and Jaffa is about an hour travel today in the car. You know, but no smog, no skyscrapers in the way. You have coastline, which have been fairly low, and you have Jerusalem, which is definitely higher elevated. And you could see the smoke rising. And so he would stand in Jaffa, turn towards Jerusalem, okay? His seat would be in the back. He would turn towards Jerusalem, and he could probably peer through the sky and look for that elevation where the smoke is coming from. Put his eyes on there, and he would know which time of the day would coincide to the sacrifices. And that's when he would pray. And that's what a lot of people actually did. Now, if they weren't close enough to hear the trumpets, because remember the priests would bless the trumpets at the time of the sacrifice as well. They didn't have watches, so that was kind of like the ancient alarm clock, right? You could really connect to the temple experience in a much more tangible way that most of us can think about, because there were no obstructions, no high buildings around us.
And there was always a plan and always a unity for Gentiles as well, to pray towards the temple when Solomon built it. And put that in there, that when Gentiles will pray towards the temple, their prayers get heard as well.
Yeah, people can
Always been included.
people can pray in Cairo and just know to face Jerusalem. And guess what? God would hear their prayers. Why? Because that was one of the answers that God gave to Solomon. When Solomon dedicated the temple, and he said that long prayer, saying, when people look towards your temple and they pray, answer their prayer. And if a foreigner does this, answer their prayer. And then it says the fire from Hashem fell and consumed the sacrifices. That was God's answer to Solomon's prayer, saying, yes, that's how it's going to happen. And the temple was dedicated. That was always the plan. That was the idea, that from anywhere people could face the right direction. Even if they couldn't see it, they knew it was there. If they're close enough, if you're close enough within the small country of Israel, you could see the temple. You knew those hills, you knew those roads. You knew where they led, essentially, because most of the time people traveled on foot. They had to have pretty good bearing with that. It's pretty good stuff. So you still want to know where Golgotha is? I can say I'll find you a map. I'll see if I find you something. I knew I had one here that was more modern. There you go. All right, so here's what it looks like now, right? And if we were to reconstruct it, that's sort of what it would have looked like. So where is Golgotha? If you go all the way to the corner, right there, right in this spot, it would have been outside of the city walls. The modern city walls run where they run today. They were not. That was called the new city. That was the expansion. And so it would have been right out there where you see that gate, not far from the Yafo gate today. That's where it would have been, like in that general area. Huh? You want me to hold that slide? Sure.
Please, see if I can get that.
Come take a picture. It's pretty cool, huh? They just took the old and superimposed on top of the modern. See, look where I've been. It says, look where I've been on Shabbat. So here's a fun one for you. See, watch this. Isn't that cool? You like that? You want to play it again? Okay, watch this. So this is modern. This is modern, right? Ready? Watch it. Back in time, right? Traveling back in time. That's what we're trying to do. So obviously, if the temple is rebuilt, it will probably be different. Okay, it will probably be different. We're not going to go back to that building, but the likelihood of people honoring some of the traditions that we have, even with imagination and reconstruction and people have done, like I said, a lot of this is imagination. Do we know that this is how the roof line was? No, sort of, kind of, maybe, but not exactly. So things might look a little bit different, but that's how it was. So that is a pretty close reconstruction based on the contours of the walls where they are today. What is still standing is the foundation of the temple outer plaza. Everything on the inside has been pretty much demolished, but the outer plaza is standing, and guess what's still there? All the stuff underneath. All the priestly chambers they were deep under in the mountain, some of them are still there. The priestly chambers are still there. People did not go down there. Some of them have been buried and have not been touched. And the archaeologists have not been allowed to go in there. So there are things yet to be discovered in those subterranean chambers and tunnels, and there's all kinds of things. Do you know the book of Baruch tells us that when Nebuchadnezzar was approaching Israel and getting ready to attack, and it says that all of the special holy items, they were hidden. They were taken away to safety and hidden. Plus the priests had multiples of everything, because it's not one time that the temple was robbed and desecrated by pagans. So they always had backups of backups, but the holy items were hidden and stashed away deep into some caves and covered up with stones. So who knows, maybe some of them will come out sometime soon. You know, it just has to be the right time.
Do you think the Ark of the Covenant is
Maybe. Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? Like if they hid everything else, why not that? Like, who knows? Maybe that's what's hidden. Now, I did hear stories of people who claim they found it, but I still yet to see it.
When you were talking about the Levites in the morning and whatnot, I was thinking of Luke 21 at the very end, the last two verses. It said, every day Yeshua was teaching in the temple, and every night he would go out and spend the night on the mountain that is called Olivet. All the people came early in the morning to him in the temple to hear him.
Yeah. So where he would have been in the temple is right by where the mikvahs are, the steps of the rabbis. This is where a lot of the teaching happened, right out there. There was a chamber right there where actually a council met, but this is where the mikvahot were. This was one of the major entrances into the temple. And a lot of people that came in, they came in because there was a triple gate there. And they're called the steps of the rabbis for a reason, because people literally sat on the steps and taught there for hours. So that was kind of a place, which is cool. So got to go walk those steps again. Guess what? They're still there. The steps are still there. They didn't destroy that. It's still there.
And that's the people of Israel, like distinct from the rulers over the people of
Right.
Israel. Like when I was reading, like John 8, and it's like, we've never been slaves to anyone. Said no Jew in history, ever. Not a real Jew.
So there's a lot of cryptic stuff that we can read about, but this is it. That's the vision. That's a little blast from the past for you using modern photography. This was a picture not so long ago. Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good discussion as usual. Great questions.
Need the rug down, man.
So, yes.